morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Laura Brewer, Communications Director here at the Department of Justice in North Carolina. First, we're going to hear from Attorney General Stein, followed by Attorney General Becerra, after which you all can ask questions by using the raise hand function on your Zoom. I will mention that the questions should pertain to this announcement that we're making today and not other topics. So with that, Attorney General Stein.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Today, along with California Attorney General Xavier Becerra, I'm making an important announcement about how we are holding accountable the corporations that created and profited from the opioid epidemic. Today, we join with 53 attorneys general, representing 47 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories, to announce a $573 million national settlement with McKinsey. McKinsey worked for 15 years as a consulting firm to Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family to increase sales of their highly addictive and often deadly OxyContin prescription opioid. For the past year, we have all rightly been focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the most devastating global public health crisis in a century. But we cannot forget the still raging opioid epidemic that is the deadliest drug epidemic in our nation's history. Even though it has receded in the news, it has not gone away. In fact, it pains me to report that it is deadlier than it has ever been. We had achieved real progress over recent years to reduce the overdose death rate. In 2019, we actually saw the first decline in years. Those gains, sadly, have reversed because of COVID. The unemployment, isolation, anxiety, and disruption this pandemic has unleashed have led to a rise in addiction and overdose greater than ever. But how did we get here in the first place? How have so many people become addicted to opioid pills, heroin, and fentanyl? This crisis is fundamentally one of overprescribing. Beginning in the late 90s and continuing for about 20 years, as opioid prescribing per capita increased dramatically, opioid overdose deaths jumped in near perfect lockstep with the increase in pill prescriptions. This dramatic change in doctors prescribing opioids did not just happen. Pharmaceutical companies led by Purdue Pharma drove this spike in prescriptions by pushing their addictive pills on prescribers and patients across the country. That's why I've sued Purdue Pharma and the family that owned and controlled it, the Sacklers. I continue to pursue them and their billions in bankruptcy proceedings that are ongoing. Through that litigation, we made an important discovery. Purdue Pharma didn't dream up all of its ideas on its own on how to push its pills. No, it paid global consulting firm McKinsey handsomely for 15 years to design marketing plans to help it sell more pills to more patients at increasing potency for longer periods of time. McKinsey developed a plan to turbocharge OxyContin sales. It engaged in market research, sales representative training, IT system development, and marketing, all to increase sales of addictive pills. For instance, McKinsey recommended that Purdue Pharma use its sales representatives to target the high volume prescribers writing the most scripts so that they would prescribe even more. McKinsey's efforts worked. The number of pills prescribed, Purdue's profits, and McKinsey's fees skyrocketed. But so did the number of people addicted, the number of people overdosed, the number of lives lost. In North Carolina, more than 2,000 people die of an opioid overdose every year. And the number of people whose lives have been ruined because of their addiction to this morphine molecule found in opioids is in the tens of thousands. And it's not just the people directly affected with opioid use disorder who suffer. Talk to their family members, their friends, and their loved ones, and you'll quickly learn that the suffering is as deep as it is widespread. Since I first took office, I've made it a priority to hold accountable the companies that created and profited from people's addiction. They must pay to clean up the mess that they made. Today's $573 million settlement with McKinsey represents important progress in this effort. Under the settlement, McKinsey will pay settling states $573 million. North Carolina's share is nearly $19 million, with the vast majority payable in the next 60 days. These funds must go to abating the crisis. But we also demand that McKinsey change its business practices. It can no longer consult for any company in the opioid business. It must produce all of its relevant documents to a repository for disclosure to the public. Its partners must make an ethics certification every year, and it must notify any governmental entity of any potential conflicts when it's bidding on work. The $573 million settlement with McKinsey builds on the $1.6 billion settlement we reached last year with Mallinckrodt, another opioid manufacturer, and it will not be our last. We continue our negotiations with the other opioid manufacturers and distributors. If the participants in those negotiations will step up and do the right thing, we can bring desperately needed relief to thousands more people in North Carolina and millions across the country. I will not stop fighting to ensure that the companies that created and fueled this crisis pay to heal the people struggling with the disease of addiction. Thank you. My good friend and colleague, the Attorney General of California, Javier Becerra, who has been a steadfast leader in this multi-state opioid effort. He has also, as you know, been the leader in defending the Affordable Care Act in federal court. And it's my pleasure to hand it off to him now.
To Attorney General Stein, thank you very much for all the work that you've been doing, for inviting me to join with you today for this announcement. I also want to take a moment to thank some of the team at the California Department of Justice. Nick Akers, our Senior Assistant Attorney General, Judy Fiorentini, who is our Supervising Deputy Attorney General, Michelle Burkhart, who is a Deputy Attorney General, Timothy Lundgren, another DAG, Laurel Carnes, a DAG, Renee Jedkowitz, another DAG, and Nima Rosvar, another Deputy Attorney General, along with Melanie Fontes Rayner, Special Assistant to the Attorney General. From Melanie to all the team, I want to thank them for the work that they did to help us get to this point in this settlement. When 47 states, red and blue, urban and rural, large and small, along with the District of Columbia and the 5 territories come together, that's a good start for America. And that is going to be good for Americans. And when it deals with tackling the opioids crisis, it's even better. McKinsey & Company, as Attorney General Stein has mentioned, is a big firm. They're one of the largest consulting companies in the world. They earn millions at advising opioid companies over the years. They were part of a machine that disrupted, in fact, destroyed lives and families in America. Today, we hold McKinsey to account, $573 million. Those monies are sorely needed back home to treat and prevent opioids in the worst of ways. Nearly 60 million of those dollars are headed towards California communities. Now, along with the different provisions that Attorney General Stein mentioned, I think it's also important to note that the reason we were able to pursue this action against this company was because they violated our laws, and that's what we allege in our complaints. False advertising laws, unfair competition laws, and the result is that we can take them to court to make sure that they are penalized for what they have done. This is a settlement, but we certainly took action and we filed complaints based on that. America lost 81,000 Americans to overdose in 2020. That's the most we've ever lost in 1 year. In California's county of San Diego, one example, more people overdosed in the first 6 months of 2020 than in all of 2019. And COVID-19 and the pandemic it has unleashed is driving overdoses even higher. Today's announcement is a big deal because, well, it's a big deal. But on top of that, it's not the last deal, and it's not the biggest of the settlements and actions that we as a collective of states and AGs will take. The state attorneys general across our nation are working to hold the opioids industry accountable. Today, we took an important step, but we're not done. I'll turn it back over to AG Stein.
Thank you, General Becerra. Laura, you want to moderate the questions?
Yeah. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand function. Again, we ask that you keep your questions specific to the topics of this press conference. And also, if you want to ask a question of a specific AG, please ask that person when you do. While we wait for those to start to come in, Attorney General Becerra, we have a request for you to give some remarks in Spanish, please.
Sure, very briefly then. Buenos días. Tengo el gusto de estar aquí con el Procurador General de North Carolina, el señor Josh Stein, juntos con otros 45 procuradores generales de los estados de este país, con todos los territorios que tiene los Estados Unidos y sus fiscales general. Hemos logrado este acuerdo con la compañía McKinsey & Company, donde McKinsey va a pagar $573 millones por su involucramiento en el asunto de los opioides, las drogas que son muy adictivas. Y hoy estamos anunciando que vamos a poder mandarle a nuestras comunidades recursos que necesitan para aliviar el dolor y la pérdida que han sufrido muchas de nuestras comunidades. Esto es algo grande porque se necesita algo grande, especialmente durante este tiempo de COVID, pero damos gracias a todos nuestros colegas fiscales que han trabajado para lograr este acuerdo hoy. Gracias. Thank you.
Okay, Will Doran.
Hi there. I had a question for Attorney General Stein. I was hoping that you could just repeat the North Carolina specific financial numbers you mentioned earlier, and if there is any idea of where exactly that money is going to go and how it's going to be used. If you give any details on that, I would appreciate it.
Happy to, Will. North Carolina's share is just shy of $19 million, and the vast majority of that, approximately $15 million, will be paid in the next 2 months. The balance will be paid in 3 other installments over the next 3 years. And we're going to work with leaders across the state to use those funds to deal with the consequences of this crisis. And the range of options available to us are very wide, and we'll get you a copy of the settlement, which has an appendix that lists permissible uses, but it includes things like funding treatment centers or funding county paramedics who do responses for overdoses, or treatment programs in county jails. So the list is really as broad as you can imagine, as long as it's going to deal with the consequences of the crisis.
Sarah Randazzo.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm just wondering if there's anything you can say on how quickly this deal came together and when you first started talking with McKinsey, and kind of contrast that in light of the broader opioid talks that I know have been going on for more than 18 months now and seem to not be finalized. I'm just wondering how this one was able to come together so much quicker than those broader talks.
This one did come together more quickly. McKinsey really came into our sights through the process of the bankruptcy of Purdue Pharma, when we saw the documents that highlighted the way in which it was absolutely intertwined in developing and frankly implementing the marketing plans at Purdue Pharma to push more of its pills into doctors' offices and into patients across the country. And it came together more quickly, I think, frankly, because we had a defendant who was motivated to sell. And that's why I think both General Becerra and I, in our remarks, each reference the other companies that are out there, that we urge them to get to the bottom line. Let's wrap these discussions up. Let's finalize negotiations so that we can deliver more meaningful resources to deal with this crisis, which is just raging across the country.
And if I could just add, Sarah, that I suspect the same applies to North Carolina, that here in California, we've been investigating McKinsey for about 2 years. And so while the settlement may seem to have sort of gelled quickly, it's not because it just all of a sudden was in the good nature of the parties here to come together. It was because, as AG Stein has mentioned, our investigations turned up some pretty credible evidence that I believe led McKinsey to say, better to address this now than to wait and go to court. And we hope that that will be the case with other companies that played a role, as I call them, the machine, the opioids machine, that played a role in creating this crisis.
Savannah Levins.
Hi, Attorney General Stein. Savannah Levins with NBC Charlotte. I got a two-part question for you. First, you mentioned after Will's question about the uses that are possible for this 19 million share for us. I'm curious what your priorities from that list would be. And also, we're running an investigation on this tonight, coincidentally. But the addiction professionals of North Carolina found 43% of providers, rehabilitation centers, said they can't survive another month. More than half have already closed at least one program. I'm curious if keeping these treatment centers open is top of your priorities.
There's no question that the broad topic of treatment is our number one priority. There are a number of ways you can facilitate and strengthen treatment programs in North Carolina and across the country. But yes, it'd be absolutely devastating if the few programs that exist in North Carolina to treat people with opioid addiction were to close, because then folks would have nowhere to go. So we are going to try to help people in need of treatment get that treatment. But there are programs that are offered in jails to do that, in courts to do that, obviously in healthcares and in the healthcare system and through hospital systems. There are needle exchange programs that are harm reduction that keep people alive until they're in a place where they're ready to go get treatment. So unfortunately, there's really no end to the ideas that exist, worthy ideas to be funded. Sadly, the needs are greater than the resources that have been deployed for this problem.
Jeff Mulvihill.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I wanted to see if there are any other companies that didn't themselves manufacture or sell opioids that are being investigated as part of the broader look at the opioid machine.
We are looking at the distributors of the pills in addition to the manufacturers. So the distributors are the ones who take the pills from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. And we have been investigating them and engaged in negotiations with them for a long time. Javier, anything to add? Okay.
Thank you.
Kenny Beck.
Hi, my question is for Attorney General Stein. You mentioned the number of families in the state of North Carolina who have been impacted by this crisis over the last few years, in particular, the number of families who have lost a loved one. Obviously, this settlement won't bring them back, but it might prevent more deaths in the future. Anything that you'd like to say to families that either have struggled with this in the past or are currently struggling with a loved one battling addiction?
All right. There are so many families, practically every person I know in some way at some level has been touched by this. And it's absolutely devastating. 20-some thousand families have lost a loved one in North Carolina to an opioid epidemic. And the holes that are in their heart can never be filled. But I've been incredibly inspired as I have met with these folks across the state about their emotional resilience and their passion to try to prevent any other parent from experiencing the depth of pain and sorrow that they have when they lost their loved one, their child. And I know that there are so many others who are dealing with it every day, and they wake up every morning praying that their child is still alive because they never know. They fear that will be the day that they get the call that they dread with every fiber in their body. And so what we want to do is help as many people who are sick with this chronic illness of opioid use disorder get healthy. This is a treatable disease. And if we can help people get the treatment that they need, then they can live the same life we all want, which is one of autonomy and joy, where we make decisions every day based on what's going to make our lives better, and not consumed by trying to find that morphine molecule. How can I get this pill today? How can I get this heroin in my body today? Because the compulsion is so strong. And so that's what the future we want for North Carolina families.
Jamise Price.
Attorney General Stein, you mentioned that there was a settlement, I believe, last year as well. I wanted to know, how did the state of North Carolina use that funding to help with the opioid addiction? And do you think that it was effective, seeing that we lost about 20,000 people, as you mentioned, last year, and how the COVID pandemic made a spike in overdose deaths?
Thank you, Jamise. And just to be clear, in case I misspoke, which happens too frequently, it's been about 20,000 people collectively, and last year it was around 2,000.
Okay.
The funds in that Mallinckrodt settlement were negotiated in bankruptcy proceeding. And unfortunately, because of bankruptcy and the slowness of that process, we haven't started getting the funds in yet. And so, unfortunately, we haven't been able to put those funds to good use. We will as soon as we can finalize the bankruptcy process, and the uses of those funds will be the same types of uses that we are requiring of these funds with McKinsey.
Casey Cunningham from WRAL asks if you can talk about some of the addiction and recovery programs in North Carolina that could benefit, and how will this make an impact for those currently struggling with opioid addiction?
There are a number of remarkable programs, and they vary because there's not just one single path to recovery. Coastal Horizons in Wilmington, or Healing Transitions here in Raleigh, TROSA in Durham. They're just really strong programs across the state, and they need to have the resources to fund the treatment programs, because not everybody who comes in has the means to pay for it. So that's what we want to bolster the entire treatment and recovery infrastructure in this state so that it works as well as possible for as many people as possible.
And Chris Stoner Mertz asks, how will the funds be distributed at each state's level?
Each state will come up with its own plan, and I'll leave it to General Becerra to talk about his, but we have a list of permissible activities, and we're going to work with leaders across the state to ensure that those funds get distributed across the state and put to very good use.
And I'll simply add that along with what Attorney General Stein has mentioned, anything from drug courts, if your state uses drug courts, housing to help supplement what might be available. As Attorney General Stein has mentioned, we're going to try to provide comprehensive services to help those communities that are already treating those who have the disorder, who are addicted, but it's trying to make sure we can prevent it, not just treat it.
John Randalls.
Can you hear me? And okay, thanks for taking my question. My question is, does the settlement agreement require McKinsey to continue providing assistance of some kind to the states in their ongoing investigations into opioid manufacturers? Or has McKinsey voluntarily offered to continue providing some sort of assistance to the investigations?
McKinsey McKinsey is required to produce all relevant documents of its consulting services to any opioid manufacturer to a repository that will be available not only to the state, but to the general public. And we thought that transparency, similar to what happened in the tobacco settlement, was a very important part of our negotiations.
And Josh, if I could add, McKinsey must continue an investigation it's undertaking involving two of its partners who may have engaged in activity to try to destroy evidence, emails, correspondence regarding the crisis. And so that will move forward and things could be uncovered as a result of that investigation.
Baby?
I am BB Miller. I'm representing Spectacular Magazine in Durham. My questions are for Attorney General Stein. I was curious, what has your dialogue with the Black community in the state and other communities of color and vulnerable communities been like, and how will relief be targeted and distributed in an equitable manner?
Ensuring that these funds are distributed equitably across the state where this crisis has devastated. And frankly, the sad truth is that the opioid epidemic is really an equal opportunity destroyer, because I think that the pill part of the crisis in particular was more focused in rural and wider communities. But as the crisis has evolved into heroin and fentanyl, urban areas have been equally afflicted. And so it is imperative that these funds be distributed across the state in a way that will meaningfully provide relief to people who have been affected.
Thank you. And I know the heroin and opioid prevention, or the HOPE Act of 2018, drew some concern from activists and advocates in the state. Is that still on the books and still being used?
It has been, and we haven't. The HOPE Act was a bill that my office championed, the legislature enacted. It allowed law enforcement greater tools to identify prescribers who were engaged in pushing pills out into their community. And it has been used, it required special training by law enforcement to access that database. And it has been used in investigations. And fortunately, I haven't heard of any issues that have resulted from that.
All right. And lastly, which specific counties in the state are you focusing on right now? What seem to be the hot spots?
As I said earlier, it is incredibly distributed, the impacts of the opioid crisis. And so there are differing rates, some counties, Wilkes County, Surrey County, but it depends on what metric you use to determine their overprescription and their overdose deaths. But the sad truth is that there are many, many, many counties in North Carolina that have had devastating impacts from this crisis, and we will make sure that the funds are distributed fairly across the state.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? If so, please use the raise hand function. While we wait a moment, Attorney General Stein, do you want to talk a little bit about More Powerful NC and your work to prevent the opioid epidemic in North Carolina?
Yeah, General Becerra hit on this earlier, that it's not only about treating the opioid, people suffering with opioid addiction, but it's trying to prevent new people from becoming addicted and starting down that path. And so we rolled out a program called More Powerful NC. The website's morepowerfulnc.org, and it has incredibly helpful, constructive information for any person who cares about this issue, whether you know anybody with addiction or not. Things that you can do as an individual, things that you can do as a town council member or as a chief of police or a sheriff, that you can do to attack the crisis. But also there are resources there for people and families that are suffering. And we encourage folks to go check it out.
Great. I think that concludes our questions today. If anyone has anything additional, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'll be glad to answer any of your questions the day goes on. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, General Becerra.
Thank you, Josh.